want you to take a second and just think about the people you've lost in your life. And when you think about what actually stuck around, the memories that just randomly pop into your head on Tuesday afternoon, what are they?
It's almost never what you'd expect.
I would bet anything it is rarely those grand cinematic moments, like you probably don't fixate on the sweeping speeches or the perfectly curated family vacations.
No, it's always the idiosyncratic everyday quirk.
It's the way they clear their throat or their incredibly specific order at a diner or, some weird tough love phrase they used to repeat until you just rolled your eyes.
Right, because human memory has this really fascinating way of discarding the polished, socially acceptable highlights when it comes to profound grief.
Why is that?
Well, we tend to cling to the granular kind of unglamorous details because those are the fragments of a person that bypass the analytical part of our brain. They hit our sensory memory directly.
Oh, wow. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, those hyper-specific quirks are the undeniable physical proof that this person actually occupied space in the real world. They ground the loss in reality.
That grounding effect is actually our mission for today's Beyond the Words Presents.
I'm really excited for this one.
Me too. So we are exploring a raw, deeply personal piece of writing simply titled Little Things by R. Yearby, a poet and thespian originally from Florida, but currently making a name for himself in Frankfurt, Germany.
It's such a powerful text.
It really is, and we're going to unpack how a handful of brief, everyday memories and a few lines of incredibly tough love can just perfectly encapsulate the overwhelming complexity of grief.
Also, identity and the psychological inheritance we get from the people who raised us. What makes this piece of writing so compelling to me is how much it accomplishes entirely through subtext. But on the surface, the writer is just recounting things someone used to say to them growing up, like just random quotes.
Just casual memories.
But if you look at the mechanics behind those quotes, you realize it is essentially a survival manual.
The survival manual disguised as nostalgia.
Yes, Renard is looking back at these seemingly random directives and recognizing the profound, often hidden architecture behind them.
And the writer actually points us toward that realization right at the beginning. There's this line that says, "The lessons that are learned when you are no longer strong, you always remember the little things."
The concept of being no longer strong is just a perfect entry point into the psychology of this story.
How so?
Well, vulnerability is what forces this kind of retrospective clarity when the psychological armor you wear every day gets shattered by a major loss.
Which happens to all of us.
Right, your brain simply does not have the bandwidth to hold on to complex, abstract philosophies. You revert to the foundational code.
You just reach for the simple things.
Yes, the little things because they are sturdy. You know they will hold your weight.
So let's dive into what that foundational code looks like here, because it is not a gentle one.
Not at all.
The poet recalls the deceased's voice through a few specific memories, and what we get is almost like a translation dictionary of tough love.
That's a great way to put it.
For instance, there's a memory of being told, "You beat his ass," or "I will beat you."
Yeah, that one stands out immediately.
To a modern ear, hearing an adult tell a kid to fight or face consequences sounds incredibly harsh, like maybe even alarming.
Oh, totally alarming by today's standards.
But Yearby doesn't remember this as cruelty. He translated that memory into the core philosophy of never give up.
Because it immediately establishes the socioeconomic and cultural reality of this narrator's childhood. I mean, this isn't a soft suburban reflection on loss where the biggest challenge was a missed soccer game.
The stakes were much higher.
Exactly. The adult in this memory was preparing a child for an environment that was fundamentally hostile.
So it's not just about winning a playground scuffle.
The underlying lesson isn't actually about violence at all. It's about the absolute refusal to surrender your physical agency.
Oh, I see.
If the world is going to come at you, you have to fight back, and the person who loves you most is demanding that you do not fold under pressure.
And that demand for resilience bleeds right into the expectations around school, too.
Oh, the report card memory.
There's another memory of the adult saying, "Getting C's on your report card means you average. Nobody wants average."
Such a tough line.
It is. But again, he translated that into the realization that he can achieve so much more. It's the same survival mechanism just applied to intellect instead of physical safety.
It is a complete refusal to let the child take the path of least resistance. I mean, a C grade is acceptable to a lot of people. It is the literal definition of adequate.
Sure, it means you passed.
But in an environment where the odds are already stacked against you, adequate is a trap.
Wow.
The adult is instilling the idea that blending in and being average will not save you. You have to be exceptional just to survive.
Which really brings up the sheer economic reality of that struggle. There's a moment in the piece that hit me incredibly hard.
Is it the shoes?
Yes. The narrator remembers the adult telling them, "We don't have Nike money. Nothing wrong with Payless shoes." And the adult interpretation of that memory is, "Don't conform. Be your own man."
The socioeconomic undertones there are just brilliant, especially when you consider the psychology of childhood.
Because kids are obsessed with brands.
Exactly. In a lot of environments, not having the name brand sneakers is a source of intense social shame. Kids weaponize consumer goods against each other to establish a hierarchy.
Yeah, wearing the cheap shoes marks you as an outsider or explicitly as poor.
And kids can be merciless about it.
They really, really can.
But look at how the adult disarms that weapon. They don't apologize for the lack of money.
There's no, "I'm sorry we can't afford it."
Not at all. And they don't express pity, which would only validate the child's shame. Instead, they reframe the Payless shoes as an active, conscious rejection of consumer conformity.
They turn it into a point of pride.
Exactly. The adult is essentially teaching the child that they do not need a corporate logo to validate their worth. It completely transforms economic hardship into a masterclass on fierce, impenetrable independence.
You know, I was reading this, and have you ever thought about how memory works? Kind of like digital compression.
Wait, like a computer file?
Yeah. I kept thinking about these childhood moments as emotional ZIP file.
Oh, I like that.
You know how a ZIP file works on your desktop? You take a massive folder of high-resolution images or gigabytes of complex data, and you compress it into one tiny little icon.
Right, it takes up a fraction of the space.
It looks like almost nothing.
But the data is densely packed, waiting for the right software to decode it.
Exactly that. On the surface, wearing Payless sneakers or running an errand to the corner store, which is another memory the narrator mentions, just being told to go buy a pack of Cools and a beer.
Just a totally normal chore.
Yeah, they seem like completely mundane childhood directives. They are tiny, compressed icons of memory. A child doesn't understand the algorithm of the zip file. You know, they just hear, "Go get my cigarettes."
Right.
But in adulthood, when the narrator finally double-clicks on them, usually catalyzed by the profound grief of losing this person, the memories unzip.
They expand.
They explode into these massive foundational life lessons. Running that errand wasn't just a chore. It was a deputization.
Oh, I love the word deputization for that.
It was the adult handing over adult currency, telling the child to navigate the neighborhood alone, effectively saying, "I trust you."
The distance of time is really the only thing that can extract that high-resolution meaning. I mean, the deceased didn't sit the narrator down and deliver a 3-hour academic lecture on nonconformity and self-reliance.
No one does that.
They bought the budget shoes, handed over a few dollars for cigarettes, and dropped the wisdom in passing. It is a highly efficient way to transfer values.
But the way Yearby handles this transfer of values, suddenly, it takes a massive turn.
It really shifts gears.
Yeah, we spend the first half of this piece entrenched in very grounded, gritty urban realism. We're talking about fistfights, report cards, corner stores, and budget sneakers.
All very concrete physical things.
And then, without warning, the realism drops away entirely. The piece plunges us into the deep end of overwhelming natural imagery.
It's a very jarring transition.
It feels like the narrator's brain just hits a wall. Like you can only intellectualize these tough love memories for so long before the physical, crushing reality of the loss breaches the perimeter, which would explain this sudden flood of water metaphors.
Moving from the intellect of memory into the raw physics of emotion is jarring, but it's a necessary transition.
Why is it necessary?
Well, remembering the tough quotes was a coping mechanism. It was a way of holding on to the deceased's strength. But grief is not intellectual, it is physiological.
You feel it in your body.
Exactly. Eventually, the sheer volume of the absence just crashes over the nervous system.
The language Renard uses to describe that crash is so intense. "I want to cry for you, break the levees of my soul, and drown myself in all this pain and sorrow, swim with this riptide of things left unsaid."
Wall-to-wall water imagery.
Yeah, it's suffocating.
And the specific engineering metaphor of the levees.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Think about what a levee actually is. It is a man-made structure. It is an artificial wall engineered through immense effort specifically to hold back a massive natural body of water.
Right.
By using that specific word, the narrator is admitting that their current state of stoicism, their refusal to break down, is entirely unnatural.
I want you, the listener, to really think about that for a second. Think about the last time you had to hold it together during a crisis, maybe for your kids or your family. You build those exact same psychological levees just to get through the day.
And it takes constant, exhausting maintenance to keep them up. Because grief is a force of nature, like a swollen river after a storm. The narrator has constructed these psychological levees using the tough love lessons they were taught just to stay functional.
But you can't hold back a flood forever.
No, and they can feel the internal pressure building to a critical point. They actually want the structure to fail. They want to be consumed by the flood, because at least in the flood, they are finally feeling the honest truth of the loss instead of just managing it.
They are actively, and perhaps unhealthily, suppressing this massive natural force. But I actually have a question about the next metaphor he used.
The driftwood line.
Yeah, because it kind of flips our usual understanding of life and death on its head.
It does.
Right after the riptide line, the narrator says, "I am driftwood now floating away as you finally swim upstream."
Such a beautiful line.
But I struggle with that imagery because the roles feel entirely reversed. Usually, we think of the living as the ones who are still in a struggle, fighting the current, dealing with the daily grind. We are the ones swimming upstream.
Right. The living are doing the hard work.
And the deceased. We say they are at rest. We picture them finally at peace, just floating away. So why would the narrator frame themselves as the passive driftwood while picturing the person who passed away as the one with the strength to swim upstream?
It's a great question, and it really challenges how we conceptualize the essence of the people we lose. Well, go back to the portrait we painted of the deceased in the first half of the story. This was a person of immense, unrelenting willpower.
Someone who wouldn't even let you settle for a C.
Exactly. Someone who demanded excellence, who fought back against poverty, who refused to accept average in any form. In the narrator's mind, that person is an eternal force of forward momentum. They were the central engine of the family's survival. Even in death, the narrator simply cannot conceptualize this person as passive. To the narrator, the deceased is still conquering, still moving toward the source, swimming upstream against the ultimate current of mortality.
Which means without that engine, the narrator loses their gravitational center.
Precisely. If your entire worldview has been anchored by someone else's fierce direction, someone constantly telling you to fight, to study, to stand out, what happens when that anchor vanishes?
You become driftwood.
You are still on the water. You are still physically existing, but you have no internal propulsion. You are just at the mercy of the tide. The psychological unmooring there is absolute.
It is incredibly isolating. You're left floating in the wreckage of your own emotional levees.
It's a terrifying place to be.
And feeling that untethered, caught in that riptide, the poet does the only thing he can do to survive the moment. He grasps for a lifeline.
We go back to the quotes.
Yes, they try to find an anchor again by returning to the final pieces of advice from the deceased. The story yanks us out of the emotional chaos of the water metaphors and puts us right back into strict rules of conduct.
The text notes how strange it is to hear these little things so clearly now that the distance between you and I becomes a universe.
Calling it a universe of distance highlights the absolute cold finality of death. But across that void, the narrator hears two last directives. First, if you have to ask if you should wear a tie, wear a tie. And second, if you are going to do it, then do it right.
We are right back to the presentation of the self and the refusal to be average.
Wearing a tie, though,
It's formal, right? It is restrictive. It requires a physical tightening around the throat, which is the literal opposite of breaking down and gasping for air in a rictus.
Oh, wow. That physical contrast is huge.
It's all about composure. The deceased is effectively saying, when in doubt, default to respect. Default to showing up as your most disciplined, put-together self.
And the tragic part is how the narrator applies that final directive. They take, if you're going to do it right, and they apply it to the act of grieving itself.
Yeah, this is where it really hurts to read.
It brings us to the final and honestly most devastating lines of the piece. The narrator says, I want to do this right. I wish I could cry for you, but I know you wouldn't want me to you.
The narrator is attempting to honor the deceased by applying their strict rules of excellence to the mourning.
Wow.
The deceased demanded unwavering strength in life, so the narrator feels fundamentally obligated to project that same strength in the face of death.
But I look at that resolution, and I have to ask, is this actually a functional way to grieve? Because to me, it feels like a terrible paradox.
It is a paradox, absolutely.
We spent the whole first half of this deep dive admiring these tough love lessons, right? The strength, the stoicism, the refusal to settle for palest shame. Those are the traits that made the deceased so admirable. They successfully prepared the narrator for a harsh world.
They provided the necessary armor.
But now, in this moment of profound loss, those exact same lessons are acting as the levees holding back their humanity.
Yeah.
The expectation of strength is the very thing preventing the narrator from experiencing the emotional release they desperately need to heal. They explicitly tell us, I want to cry, I wish I could. The physical urge is there, but they don't do it.
Because I know you wouldn't want me to.
They are entirely trapped by the ghost of that tough love.
It is the central tension of the entire reflection, and really a profound paradox of human conditioning. The psychological gifts the deceased gave the narrator, resilience, stoicism, pride, they're double-edged swords.
They protect you, but they also cut you.
Right. In the daily grind of life, those traits are a shield against poverty and marginalization. But in the intimate, vulnerable space of grief, that shield becomes a cage.
And it's a cage they willingly lock themselves in out of pure devotion.
What is truly heartbreaking is the narrator's immense self-awareness regarding this trap.
They know exactly what they're doing.
They do. They recognize the psychological cost. They want to break the levees. They know the water is rising and the pressure is critical. But their loyalty to the deceased's philosophy outweighs their own psychological need for catharsis.
That is so heavy.
They are making an active choice to suffer the internal crushing pressure of unexpressed grief because, in their mind, crying would be a betrayal of the standard they were taught to uphold. It's an act of supreme devotion to the person they lost, but it requires an agonizing level of self-denial.
It's like they're choosing to remain the driftwood, quietly and passively floating. Because to thrash around and sob would be unseemly, wouldn't be wearing a tie.
And that is the ultimate nature of inheritance. We don't just inherit the physical items, the money, the house, the photographs. We inherit the psychological rule books. We internalize the standards of the people who raise us, and we enforce those rules upon ourselves long after the author of the rules is gone.
Let's zoom out and just kind of look at the emotional journey this piece takes us on.
It's quite a ride.
We started by looking at a few seemingly disconnected, gritty childhood memories. A thread about a schoolyard fight, the shame of budget shoes, an errand to buy cools. And we saw how the narrator unpacked those little things, those ZIP files of memory, to reveal huge, life-sustaining lessons about nonconformity, resilience, and trust.
But then we explored the shadow side of that tough love inheritance. When the reality of death finally sets in, the narrator is overwhelmed by a natural disaster of emotion.
And instead of letting the floodwaters run their course, instead of letting the levees break and actually feeling the loss, they retreat back into the rigidity of the rulebook.
They choose to honor the dead by violently holding back their tears, because if you're going to do it right.
It is a devastating portrait of suppressed grief masquerading as honor.
It really forces us to examine the invisible scaffolding we use to build our reality. The little things people say to us are never just passing comments.
No, they stick around forever.
They become the inner voice that dictates how we are allowed to feel, even in our darkest moments.
Which brings us right back to where we started today. I asked you to picture the people you've lost, and those quirky, highly specific memories that stick with you. The way they told a joke, or the specific brand of tough love they handed out when you failed.
The little things.
The little things. After unpacking the psychology of this story, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
I love this.
When we fiercely hold on to these little things, when we diligently follow the strict rule books left behind by those we've lost, constantly telling ourselves it's what they would have wanted, does it actually keep their spirit alive for us, or does it just prevent us from figuring out who we are without them? Think about that the next time you hear their voice in the back of your head.
Wow. Awesome show. Thank you all for listening. Talk to us in the comments.
Thank you so much. We would not be here without you. Please like, subscribe, and hit that notification button. Join us next time as we go beyond the words.